The boy tied his shoelace the exact same way Ethan Cole had been taught when he was 5. Tight loop, double pull, slight tilt of the wrist like it meant something no one else could see. The morning sun filtered through the tall oak trees lining Riverside Park, casting long golden streaks across the damp grass, the kind that made everything look softer than it really was, the kind that made a man believe, just for a second, that control was still within reach. And Ethan Cole had built his entire life on control, on precision, on knowing the outcome before the first move was even made. But in that moment, standing 10 yards away from a child he had never seen before, something unfamiliar pressed into his chest, quiet at first, then sharp enough to make him stop mid-step as the rhythm of his morning run broke apart without warning, his breath catching not from exertion but from recognition, because the boy didn't just resemble him. He mirrored him in ways that logic couldn't file away, couldn't dismiss, couldn't reframe as coincidence. The angle of his jaw, the way his brows pulled together in concentration, even the small exhale through parted lips as he finished tying the lace. It was all there, too exact, too precise, like someone had taken a memory Ethan didn't know he'd lost and placed it back in front of him without permission. And for a man who had spent the last decade making billion-dollar decisions without hesitation, the inability to move forward or step away felt almost unbearable, like standing in a room where the walls had shifted just enough to remind him they were never fixed to begin with. His eyes stayed locked on the boy as laughter drifted faintly from somewhere near the playground, blending with the distant hum of traffic beyond the trees. But none of it reached him fully, not the sound, not the motion, not the world continuing exactly as it should, because everything inside him had narrowed down to that one impossible image. The boy stood up slowly, brushing his hands against his jeans, and for a brief second, he glanced toward Ethan without really seeing him. Just a passing look, casual, unguarded, but it was enough. Enough to send a quiet jolt through Ethan's system. Enough to make him feel something crack beneath the surface he had spent years reinforcing. Something that didn't belong in boardrooms or contracts or negotiations. Something that didn't respond to logic or discipline. Something that felt dangerously close to truth. And that was when he heard it. A voice, soft but steady, calling from behind the child. Noah, stay where I can see you. The name landed with weight, not because of what it was, but because of how it was spoken, grounded, familiar, protective, the kind of voice that carried history in it. And Ethan turned instinctively, his gaze shifting past the boy to the woman approaching from the gravel path, her steps unhurried, her posture straight, her presence quiet but undeniable. And for a moment, time didn't stop. It folded, compressing years into something smaller, something sharper, something that refused to stay buried. Amara Hayes didn't rush, didn't falter, didn't even change her pace when her eyes met his. And that was the first confirmation, not the child, not the resemblance, but the absence of surprise in her expression, the calm acknowledgement that settled between them like a truth that had already been decided long before this moment. Her skin caught the sunlight in a way that made it glow rather than reflect, her features composed, her gaze steady, and Ethan felt the shift immediately. The reversal of something he couldn't quite name, because for the first time in years, he wasn't the one holding the advantage. He wasn't the one setting the tone. He was reacting, trying to catch up to a narrative he hadn't even realized he was part of. Noah turned toward her voice, his face lighting up in a way that felt effortless, natural, unfiltered, and he took a few small steps in her direction before stopping again, glancing briefly back at Ethan with a curiosity that hadn't yet formed into recognition. And that distance, those few feet between them, felt heavier than any deal Ethan had ever closed, because it wasn't just space, it was time, it was absence, it was everything that hadn't happened, everything that should have, everything that now stood between them without explanation. Ethan's voice, when it finally came, didn't carry the authority it usually did, didn't hold the sharp edge people expected. It was quieter, controlled, but beneath it there was something unsteady, something searching. Tell me the truth. The words weren't rehearsed, weren't strategic. They slipped out like they had been waiting longer than he understood. And Amara didn't answer right away. She simply looked at him, not with anger, not with resentment, but with a kind of clarity that made it impossible to hide behind assumptions. The park seemed to exhale around them, the breeze lifting the edges of her hair, the faint creak of a swing somewhere in the distance, the soft rhythm of footsteps passing by, without noticing the gravity of what was unfolding just a few feet away, and Ethan realized, with a certainty that settled deeper than doubt, that whatever answer came next would not be something he could negotiate, not something he could reframe or redirect. It would simply exist, unchangeable. And for a man who had built an empire on the ability to shape outcomes, that realization alone felt like losing ground. Amara's voice, when she finally spoke, was even, measured, carrying no hesitation, no need to soften the impact. "Yes," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "He's yours." And just like that, the world didn't explode, it didn't shatter. It didn't collapse the way people imagined life-changing moments would. It narrowed, it sharpened, it focused into something almost unbearably precise. Ethan's gaze dropped to the boy again, to Noah, who was now watching them both with quiet curiosity, unaware of the weight his presence carried, unaware that his existence had just rewritten something fundamental in a man who had never planned for him, never accounted for him, never even known to look. And yet there he was, real, undeniable, standing in the sunlight with the same eyes, the same features, the same unconscious habits that couldn't be taught or copied, only inherited. Ethan took a step forward, not consciously, not strategically, just instinct, but Amara's voice stopped him before he could close the distance. "Don't," she said, not loudly, not harshly, but with a firmness that held more power than any raised tone ever could. And he paused. The movement cut short, his control returning just enough to recognize the boundary she had placed, not just physically, but emotionally, historically, completely. "You don't get to walk in like this," she continued, her gaze steady, her voice still calm. "You didn't stay." The words weren't thrown, they weren't meant to wound. They were stated, plain, undeniable, and that made them hit harder than anything else could have, because there was no argument against them, no angle to reframe, no detail to dispute. Ethan's mind moved quickly, searching for context, for memory, for the point where things had diverged, but it was fragmented, incomplete, a timeline that no longer aligned with what he was seeing in front of him. Noah shifted slightly, stepping closer to Amara, his small hand brushing against hers in a gesture that spoke of familiarity, of safety, of a bond built over years Ethan had not been part of. And that simple movement carried more weight than any explanation, because it showed what had been built without him, what had grown in his absence, what existed now as a reality he could not undo. The air felt different, heavier, like something had settled into place that would not move again, and Ethan understood, in that quiet, irreversible moment, that this was not a beginning, it was a reckoning, one that had been waiting for him whether he knew it or not, one that would not bend to his timing, his rules, or his expectations. And as Noah looked up at him one more time, his expression open, unguarded, untouched by the tension between the two adults standing just feet apart, Ethan felt something shift deeper than control, deeper than logic, something that didn't ask for permission, something that simply existed now, undeniable, and for the first time in years, he didn't know what his next move would be. The silence did not break all at once. It thinned, stretched, shifted into something heavier, something that pressed against Ethan's chest as if the air itself had changed density. And for a long moment he did not move, did not speak, did not attempt to reclaim the control that had always defined him, because every instinct he had relied on before felt misplaced here, like tools designed for a different kind of world, one where outcomes could be shaped and variables reduced. But there was no reducing this, no simplifying what stood in front of him, just a woman who had already lived through the consequences of his absence, and a child who had grown into proof of it. And when Noah reached up and tugged lightly at Amara's hand, his small voice cutting gently through the tension, "Mom, are we going to the swings?" It grounded the moment in a way that made everything else feel even sharper, because life had not paused for this revelation. It had continued, steady, ordinary, full of routines Ethan had never been part of. And Amara looked down at her son, her expression softening just slightly, just enough to show that whatever distance she held for Ethan did not exist for the boy. "In a minute," she said quietly, her tone warm, familiar. "The kind of warmth that had not been present in her voice when she spoke to Ethan, and that contrast did not go unnoticed. It settled into him, not as resentment, but as realization, because this was not about punishment. It was about boundaries built over time, carefully, deliberately, without him. And when Noah nodded and stepped back, his attention drifting toward the playground again, Ethan found his voice returning. Slower this time, more deliberate. How long? He asked, the question simple, direct, but carrying weight beneath it, because he was not asking just for a number. He was asking for the size of the absence, for the distance he had unknowingly created, and Amara did not hesitate. 6 years, she answered, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, and the number landed with precision, not exaggerated, not softened, just exact, and Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath heavier than it should have been, as if those years had just been placed in his hands all at once, and his mind moved quickly, calculating timelines, tracing back through memories he had not revisited in a long time, board meetings, flights, deals, decisions that had seemed critical then, urgent even, and now felt strangely distant, like they belonged to someone else entirely. You knew, he said, not accusing, not questioning, just stating it, trying to understand the shape of what had happened without forcing it into something smaller than it was, and Amara's response came just as steady. I found out after you left, she said, her gaze shifting briefly toward Noah before returning to Ethan. You were already gone. And there it was again. Not blame, not anger, just clarity, the kind that left no room for argument. And Ethan nodded once, almost unconsciously, because there was nothing to push back against, nothing to correct, only something to absorb. And for the first time in years, absorbing felt harder than acting, harder than deciding, harder than anything he had built his life around. He took another step forward, slower this time, careful, aware of the line Amara had drawn, but unable to remain where he was, not with the weight of what he had just learned settling deeper with each passing second. I would have stayed, he said, the words coming out quieter than he expected, not defensive, not even certain, just honest in the way truth sometimes is when it arrives too late to change anything. And Amara held his gaze for a moment longer before shaking her head slightly, not dismissive, not cruel, just final. You did not, she replied, and the simplicity of it left no space for hypotheticals, no space for what could have been, only what was, and Ethan felt that distinction settle into him with more force than any argument could have carried, because it was not about intention, it was about action, about presence, about the years that had passed without him knowing they existed. Noah glanced back again, curiosity lingering in his expression, his eyes moving between the two adults as if trying to piece together something he could not yet understand, and Ethan noticed it this time, really noticed it, the way the boy studied him, not with recognition but with interest, the way children often look at something new, something unfamiliar but not immediately threatening, and it shifted something in Ethan again, something quieter, more careful, because this was not just about him and Amara. It was about a child who did not carry the history, who did not hold the context, who simply existed within the life he had known since the beginning. Does he know? Ethan asked, his voice lower now, almost cautious, as if the question itself needed to be handled with care, and Amara's answer came without hesitation. No, she said, her tone firm, protective. He knows what he needs to know. And Ethan nodded again, slower this time, understanding more in what she did not say than in what she did, because it was clear that Noah's world had been built intentionally, thoughtfully, without gaps that needed filling, without questions that demanded answers too soon. And Ethan felt the weight of that as well, not as exclusion, but as something earned over time, something that could not be stepped into without consequence. A breeze moved through the park again, lifting the edges of Noah's shirt, carrying the faint scent of cut grass and something warmer, something that reminded Ethan of summers he had not thought about in years. And for a moment, everything felt suspended again, not in shock this time, but in adjustment, in the slow, deliberate process of understanding that his life, as structured and controlled as it had been, now contained something it had never accounted for, something that would not fit neatly into schedules or projections or plans, something that required more than decision. It required presence, and that realization settled into him with a quiet certainty that did not ask for permission. It simply existed. I want to know him, Ethan said finally. The words steady now, not rushed, not forced, just clear, and Amara's expression did not change immediately. She did not react with surprise or resistance. She simply considered him for a moment, as if measuring something that went beyond the words themselves, something that reached into the years behind them and the unknown ahead. Wanting is not enough, she said, her voice calm but unyielding, and Ethan held her gaze, not pushing, not arguing, just absorbing that truth the same way he had the others, because he was beginning to understand that this was not a negotiation. It was not a situation he could resolve with logic or persistence. It was something that would unfold on terms he did not control, and for a man who had spent his life controlling outcomes, that shift alone felt like the beginning of something he had never experienced before. Noah tugged at Amara's hand again, more insistent this time. Mom, the swings, he said, his voice light, unaware of the gravity surrounding him. And Amara glanced down at him, her expression softening once more. Okay, she said, gently, before looking back at Ethan, her gaze steady, composed. This does not change today, she added, not as a warning, not as a rejection, but as a boundary clearly stated, and Ethan nodded, because he understood that too. Understood that nothing would shift instantly, nothing would be handed to him simply because he had asked. And as Amara turned slightly, guiding Noah toward the playground, Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, watching them move away, the distance between them increasing not just in space but in time, in history, in everything that had been lived without him. And yet, for the first time since he had seen the boy, he did not feel frozen. He did not feel trapped in the moment. He felt something else, something quieter but more certain, something that did not resolve the situation but anchored him within it, because he was no longer standing outside of it, no longer unaware. And as Noah climbed onto the swing and Amara steadied him with a gentle push, Ethan took a breath, deeper this time, steadier, and stepped forward, not toward them yet, not crossing the boundary that had been set, but moving within the space that now existed, a space that, for the first time, included him, whether he knew what to do with it or not. The swing creaked softly as Noah pushed himself back, his small legs stretching forward before gravity pulled him into a smooth arc, the rhythm steady, natural, the kind of motion that did not need thought, and Amara stood just behind him, one hand lightly brushing the chain every few seconds, not to guide him, but to be there, present in a way that was both subtle and constant, and Ethan remained a few yards away, close enough to see the details, far enough to respect the line that had been drawn, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his posture no longer rigid but not relaxed either, caught somewhere in between, as if his body had not yet decided how to exist in this new space. And he watched, not with the detached observation he used in meetings or negotiations, but with a focus that felt unfamiliar, almost personal, as Noah leaned back slightly at the peak of the swing, his face turning upward toward the light, his expression open, unguarded. And for a brief second Ethan saw something he recognized again, not just in the shape of the boy's features but in the way he held himself without hesitation, without doubt. And it settled into Ethan's awareness with a quiet intensity that did not fade when the moment passed. Higher, Noah said, his voice carrying just enough excitement to reach where Ethan stood, and Amara smiled faintly, the kind of smile that did not need to be wide to be real. Not too high, she replied, her tone calm, grounded, and Noah laughed softly, accepting the limit without argument, and Ethan noticed that too, the ease between them, the trust built in small, consistent moments rather than grand gestures. And it struck him then that this was what he had missed, not a single event, not a single turning point, but 1,000 ordinary seconds like this one, each adding up to something complete, something he could not reconstruct from the outside. His gaze shifted, briefly to Amara, watching the way she stood, steady, composed, her attention divided but never scattered, always returning to Noah in small, almost imperceptible ways, and he understood, with a clarity that settled deeper than anything she had said, that she had built this life deliberately, carefully, without space for uncertainty, without reliance on anyone who had not proven they would stay. And that realization did not come with resentment. It came with a kind of respect that felt heavier than anything he had experienced before, because it was earned, not given. Noah slowed the swing on his own, dragging his sneakers lightly against the ground until the motion faded, and he jumped down with a small burst of energy, turning immediately toward the climbing structure a few feet away, his attention shifting quickly, effortlessly, the way children move from one moment to the next without carrying the weight of the previous one. And Amara followed at a measured pace, her eyes tracking him without urgency, and Ethan hesitated for a second before taking a step forward, then another, closing part of the distance, but not all of it, stopping again when he reached the edge of the play area, the soft mulch beneath his shoes absorbing the sound of his movement. And Noah climbed the first rung of the structure, his hands gripping the bars with confidence, his movements sure, practiced, and Ethan felt that same quiet pull again. The recognition not just of similarity, but of connection, something that did not need explanation to exist. He is careful, Ethan said, his voice low, directed toward Amara without taking his eyes off Noah, and she glanced at him briefly before looking back at her son. He learned. She replied simply, and the words carried more than their surface meaning. They spoke of time, of guidance, of presence, and Ethan absorbed that too, adding it to the growing understanding that nothing here had been accidental. Nothing had happened without intention. Noah reached the top of the structure and paused, looking down at the slide, measuring the distance, and Ethan felt his chest tighten slightly, not from fear but from anticipation, an unfamiliar instinct. Rising without invitation, and Amara stepped a little closer, not interfering, just adjusting her position in a way that made it clear she was there, ready if needed but trusting him to take the step on his own. And Noah did, pushing off and sliding down with a quick burst of speed, landing with a soft thud at the bottom before standing up again, brushing his hands against his jeans in the same absent-minded way Ethan had seen earlier. And it was that repetition, that consistency, that made it impossible to dismiss, impossible to separate. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath steady but weighted, as if each confirmation added another layer to what he now carried. Noah, Amara called gently, and the boy turned, jogging back toward her with an easy rhythm, stopping just in front of her before glancing again at Ethan, his curiosity no longer fleeting but forming into something more defined, something that sought understanding. "Who is that?" Noah asked, his voice quiet but clear, and the question settled into the space between them with a different kind of weight, one that did not belong to the past but to the present, to what would be said now, to what would shape his understanding moving forward. And Amara did not answer immediately. She looked at Ethan first, holding his gaze for a brief moment, as if acknowledging that this was not a decision she would make alone. Not entirely, and Ethan felt that, recognized it for what it was. Not an invitation, not permission, but a shared responsibility that had not existed minutes ago. And he stepped forward one more time, slow, deliberate, stopping at a distance that still respected the boundary but brought him into clearer view, his voice steady when he spoke. "My name is Ethan," he said, not adding anything more, not claiming anything he had not yet earned. And Noah studied him for a second, his head tilting slightly, the same way Ethan had done countless times when evaluating something new. And then he nodded once, accepting the introduction without hesitation, without resistance, because to him, it was just that, a name, a person, nothing more yet. And that simplicity struck Ethan harder than anything else had so far, because it showed him exactly where he stood, not rejected, not accepted, just unknown. And Amara watched the exchange quietly, her expression unchanged but her presence steady. And Ethan understood then that this moment, as small as it seemed, was not insignificant. It was a beginning, not defined by him, not controlled by him, but real nonetheless. And as Noah turned back toward the playground, his attention already shifting again, Ethan remained where he was, no longer frozen, no longer unsure of whether to stay or leave, but aware, fully, of the path that now existed in front of him, uncertain in shape, undefined in length, but undeniably there. And for the first time, he did not look for a way to resolve it quickly. He simply stood within it, present in a way he had never been before, watching, waiting, and understanding that whatever came next would not be immediate, but it would be earned. Noah's laughter drifted across the playground again, lighter this time, untangled from the question he had asked moments before, as if the answer had settled into him just enough to satisfy his curiosity without anchoring him there. And he moved toward the next set of bars with a quick burst of energy, his sneakers kicking up small pieces of mulch as he ran, while Ethan remained still for a second longer, watching the way the boy transitioned so easily from one moment to the next, and it struck him again how different that was from the way adults carried things, how children did not linger in uncertainty the same way. They accepted what was given and continued forward, and maybe that was why this moment felt both fragile and open at the same time, because it had not been shaped yet, not fully, and as Noah climbed again, pulling himself up with a quiet determination that looked effortless but was clearly practiced, Ethan shifted his weight slightly, his attention drawn not just to the boy's movements but to the rhythm behind them, the consistency that spoke of repetition, of guidance, of someone who had been there each time he learned how to do it better, and his gaze moved briefly to Amara again, standing a few steps away, her posture unchanged, her focus steady, but there was something else now, something subtle in the way she watched Ethan without turning fully toward him, as if she was measuring not his words but his presence, and Ethan understood that without needing it explained, because this was not about what he said next, it was about what he would continue to do after this moment passed, and that realization settled deeper than anything else had so far, because it required something he had not practiced in years, patience without control, effort without guarantee, and he exhaled slowly, his breath steadying as he stepped a little closer again, not enough to intrude, but enough to remain part of the space rather than outside it, and Noah reached the top of the bars, pausing for a second before letting himself drop down with a small thud, his landing slightly uneven but balanced, and he laughed again, brushing his hands together like it was part of the routine, and Ethan found himself noticing every detail, not because he was searching for confirmation anymore, but because he was beginning to care about the things that made the boy who he was beyond resemblance. "You come here often," Ethan said, his voice low, directed toward Amara, the question. Simple but carrying a different kind of weight now, less about information and more about understanding the shape of their life. And Amara nodded once, her eyes still on Noah. "Most mornings," she replied, her tone even, not guarded but not inviting either, just factual, and Ethan absorbed that, picturing the routine without him. The repeated mornings, the same path, the same bench, the same swing, all of it forming a pattern he had never been part of. And it was not the absence itself that unsettled him. It was the realization of how complete it had been without him, how nothing had been left unfinished, and for a moment he considered the weight of that, the fact that stepping into something complete required more than just presence, it required respect for what had already been built, and that understanding shifted something in him again, subtle but real, and Noah turned back toward them, his energy beginning to settle slightly, the initial excitement of the playground easing into something calmer, and he walked over, stopping a few feet away, his gaze lifting to Ethan again, more direct this time, more intentional, and Ethan held it, not trying to interpret too much, not trying to push beyond what was there, just meeting it, and Noah tilted his head slightly, the same small gesture that had repeated itself more than once, and Ethan felt it again, that quiet echo of familiarity. But this time it did not hit him as sharply, it settled instead, like something he was beginning to accept rather than question. "Do you run here too?" Noah asked, his voice curious, simple, and Ethan nodded, the answer coming easier than anything else had so far. "Sometimes," he said, his tone steady, and Noah considered that for a second before nodding back, as if that was enough information for now, and he glanced up at Amara briefly, then back at Ethan, the connection forming not through explanation but through small exchanges that did not require more than what was given, and Amara watched quietly, her expression unreadable but her presence steady. And Ethan sensed that this moment mattered in a way that could not be rushed, could not be expanded beyond what it naturally allowed. And he did not push it, did not try to fill the space with more words than necessary, because he was beginning to understand that here, less carried more weight. Noah shifted again, looking back toward the path that led out of the playground, and then at Amara. "Are we going now?" he asked, his tone lighter, the question carrying the natural rhythm of routine, and Amara nodded. Yes, she said gently, reaching for his hand. And Noah took it without hesitation, his fingers curling around hers in a way that spoke of habit, of trust built over time. And Ethan felt that again, not as a loss but as a reality, something that existed whether he was part of it or not. And as they turned slightly, preparing to leave, Ethan stepped forward once more, the movement deliberate but careful, stopping just short of closing the distance completely. Amara, he said, her name quieter now, carrying less tension than before. And she paused, turning her head just enough to acknowledge him without fully facing him. And he held that moment, not rushing his next words, not forcing them into something more than they needed to be. I am not going anywhere this time, he said, the sentence simple, steady, not a promise shaped for effect, but a statement grounded in something he was only beginning to understand himself. And Amara studied him for a second longer, her gaze searching not for certainty, but for consistency, something that could not be proven in a single moment. And she nodded once. A small movement, not agreement, not acceptance, just acknowledgement. We will see, she replied, her tone calm, measured, and then she turned fully, guiding Noah toward the path, their steps steady, unhurried. And Ethan remained where he was as they moved away, the distance growing again. But this time it did not feel like separation. It felt like space, something that could be crossed over time rather than closed in a single step. And he watched them until they reached the edge of the park, until their figures blended into the movement of the morning. And only then did he shift, his posture straightening slightly, his breath steady. Because for the first time since this moment had begun, he understood that what came next would not be immediate, it would not be easy, but it would be real, and that was something he was no longer willing to walk away from. The path stretched ahead of them in a quiet curve, lined with low hedges and scattered benches still damp from the morning dew. And Ethan remained where he stood for a few seconds longer after they disappeared from view, his gaze fixed on the space they had just occupied, as if something might still be there if he looked closely enough. But the park moved on without him, footsteps passing, voices blending into the background, the ordinary rhythm of the morning continuing exactly as it had before. And he exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest no longer sharp but settled, like something that had found its place without asking whether he was ready for it. And when he finally turned, his steps were measured, not rushed, not aimless, but deliberate in a way that felt new. Because for the first time in a long time, he was not moving towards something he had planned, he was moving within something he had not. And that shift followed him as he left the park, the sounds fading behind him as the city took over, traffic building, engines humming, the sharp edges of glass buildings catching the light as the sun climbed higher. And everything looked the same, everything functioned the same, but he did not. And he recognized that immediately, not as confusion but as awareness, because there was now a part of his life that did not fit into any structure he had built before. And as he stepped onto the sidewalk, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve out of habit more than need, his mind did not move to schedules or calls or numbers. It moved back, tracing the moment again, the way Noah had looked at him, the way Amara had stood, the way the space between them had held more than words could carry. And it was not the shock of it that stayed with him now. It was the clarity, the undeniable fact that something real existed beyond his control, and he had been given the choice not to walk away this time. And he would not. The car was already waiting at the curb, sleek, quiet, the driver stepping out as soon as he saw Ethan approach, opening the door without a word, the movement practiced, precise. But Ethan paused for a second before getting in, his gaze drifting once more toward the direction of the park, not searching, just acknowledging. And then he stepped inside, the door closing softly behind him, sealing him back into the environment he had mastered, the leather seat cool, the faint scent of polished wood and clean air settling around him. And for a moment, everything felt as it had before, contained, structured, predictable. But the difference was immediate, because now there was something outside of this space that mattered just as much, if not more. And that awareness did not fade as the car pulled into traffic, moving smoothly through the streets, the city unfolding in familiar patterns. And Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze forward but unfocused, his thoughts not scattered but centered on one thing, one presence. One reality that had shifted everything without warning, and he reached into his pocket slowly, pulling out his phone, the screen lighting up with notifications, messages, reminders, all the pieces of the life he had maintained with precision, but he did not open any of them right away. He simply looked at the screen, then turned it off again, placing it back without action, because for once, none of it felt immediate, none of it required his attention in the way it once had. And that shift alone was enough to confirm that something fundamental had changed. "Sir." The driver's voice came from the front, respectful, measured. "Office." And Ethan paused for a brief second, the question simple, expected, but the answer no longer automatic, and he looked out the window again. Watching the city pass by, the intersections, the people, the movement, and then he spoke, his voice steady. "Not yet." And the driver nodded without question, adjusting the route smoothly, and Ethan settled back again, his gaze returning inward, not to escape, but to process, to understand the weight of what had begun, because that was what this was, not a conclusion, not a disruption, but a beginning, one that did not fit into any of the categories he had used before, and his mind moved through it carefully, not trying to solve it, not trying to control it, just acknowledging each piece as it came, Amara's words, her calm, the way she had said, "We will see," without giving anything more than that. And he understood what it meant, understood that this would not be granted, it would be earned, not through force or persistence alone, but through consistency, through presence, through time. And that was something he had not been required to give in this way before, not fully, not without condition, and the realization settled into him with a quiet weight that did not feel like resistance, it felt like direction. And as the car moved through another turn, the sunlight shifting across the interior, casting brief patterns of light and shadow against the polished surfaces, Ethan leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting against his knees, his hands loosely clasped, his posture no longer that of a man waiting for the next instruction, but of someone deciding what would come next. And for a moment, he closed his eyes, not to escape, but to center himself, to hold on to the clarity of what he had seen. Because he knew that clarity would matter, it would be the difference between reacting and responding, between stepping into this with intention or repeating the same absence that had created it. And when he opened his eyes again, the city was still moving, still unchanged, but he was not the same within it. And he reached for his phone once more, this time, unlocking it, his movements steady, deliberate, not rushed, and he opened a new contact, his thumb pausing for just a second before typing. Not a name he had stored before, but one he would not forget now, Amara Hayes. And he entered it carefully, the letters precise, as if the act itself carried meaning beyond the screen. And then he stopped again, not adding anything else, not calling, not messaging, just saving it, because he understood that the next step would not be immediate, it would not be impulsive, it would be measured, respectful of the space she had set. And as the car slowed slightly at a red light, the world outside pausing for a moment before continuing again, Ethan looked down at the name on the screen, then back up at the road ahead. And for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about what he would gain. He was thinking about what he would have to become in order to deserve what he had just found. And that thought stayed with him, steady, unshaken, as the light turned green and the car moved forward, carrying him not back to what had been, but towards something he had never planned, but would not walk away from. The car slowed to a stop in front of the building, the glass facade rising in clean, sharp lines that reflected the sky like it belonged to a different world entirely. And for a moment Ethan did not move, his hand resting lightly against the door handle without opening it, as if stepping out would pull him fully back into a version of himself that no longer fit the same way. And the driver waited, silent, accustomed to stillness but not to hesitation, and Ethan finally pushed the door open, stepping out onto the pavement with the same composed posture he had always carried. But something beneath it had shifted, something quieter, less rigid, and as he walked toward the entrance, the familiar rhythm of his environment returned, the doorman nodding in recognition, the polished floors reflecting his movement as he crossed the lobby, the faint hum of conversations echoing from different corners. All of it exactly as it had always been, structured, controlled, predictable, and yet it felt slightly distant, as if he were observing it rather than fully inside it. and the elevator doors opened without delay, the ride up smooth and silent, the numbers climbing steadily until the doors parted again to reveal the top floor, his floor, where everything was designed to respond to him, to his decisions, to his presence. And as he stepped into the office, the shift became more defined, because here, everything was still within his control, every outcome shaped by strategy, every movement calculated. But the clarity he carried from the park did not fade. It stayed with him, grounding him in a way that made the contrast impossible to ignore. His assistant rose immediately from her desk, her expression attentive, professional. "Good morning, Mr. Cole," she said, her tone steady, and he nodded once, acknowledging her without breaking stride. "Reschedule my morning," he said, his voice calm, precise, but not rushed, and she paused for just a fraction of a second, not questioning, just adjusting. "All of it?" she asked, and he met her gaze briefly. "Yes," he replied, and that was enough. She nodded and turned back to her screen, already moving pieces into place, already adapting to the shift he had introduced without explanation. And Ethan continued into his office, the door closing behind him with a soft click that sealed the space into quiet, the city visible through the wide windows stretching out below, distant, structured, and he walked to the center of the room before stopping, his gaze moving across the familiar layout, the desk, the chairs, the shelves, everything positioned exactly as he had chosen, and yet for the first time, it did not feel like the center of everything. It felt like one part of a larger structure he had not fully seen before, and he exhaled slowly, the breath steady, not heavy, just deliberate, as he moved to his desk and rested his hands against the edge, grounding himself in the moment, because this was where he would decide what came next, not through instinct alone, not through reaction, but through intention. And he reached for his phone again, the name still there, Amara Hayes, simple, unembellished, carrying more weight than any contact he had saved before, and his thumb hovered over the screen for a second, not uncertain, but measured, because he understood now that timing mattered, that rushing would not bring him closer, it would push him back into the same pattern that had created the distance in the first place. And he lowered the phone again, placing it on the desk without action, because this was not about urgency, it was about consistency. And consistency required more than a single message. It required a shift in how he moved entirely. And his gaze lifted toward the window again, the sunlight cutting across the floor in clean lines, the city moving far below. And he allowed himself a moment of stillness, not avoidance, but alignment, because he needed to understand the weight of what he was choosing before he stepped into it. And a soft knock broke the silence, his assistant stepping in just enough to speak without fully entering. "Your 10 o'clock has been moved to this afternoon," she said, and he nodded. "Good," he replied, his voice steady, and she hesitated briefly before adding, "Is there anything else?" And Ethan paused, not because he did not know, but because what he was about to say did not fit into the usual requests. It was not about business, not about strategy. It was about something entirely different, and he turned slightly, meeting her gaze with a clarity that made the next words simple. "Clear the rest of the afternoon as well," he said, and she blinked once, surprised but composed. "Of course," she answered, before stepping back and closing the door, leaving him alone again, and Ethan remained where he was, the decision settling into place not as disruption but as direction, because he was no longer structuring his day around what had always been. He was creating space for something new, something that required more than fragments of time, more than convenience. And as he moved to sit, his posture relaxed slightly, not losing its precision, but losing some of its rigidity, and he leaned back, his gaze drifting briefly to the ceiling before returning forward, and his thoughts did not scatter, they focused, moving through the next steps with a different kind of clarity, not how to control the situation, but how to enter it without disrupting it, how to show up in a way that aligned with what Amara had built rather than imposing something new onto it. And that required patience, observation, respect, and he understood that without needing it explained, because he had seen it in the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she had held her ground without raising her voice, and that image stayed with him, steady, guiding, and he reached for his phone again, unlocking it, not to call, not to demand, but to begin in the only way that made sense now, slowly, deliberately, and he opened a message, his fingers moving with precision as he typed. Not long, not complicated, just clear. I will be at the park tomorrow morning. And he paused, reading it once, not to correct, but to ensure it carried exactly what he intended. Nothing more, nothing less. And then he added, if that is all right, because he understood that even this was not his decision alone, and he sent it, the message leaving the screen without hesitation, because this was not about waiting for the perfect moment. It was about taking the first consistent step, and he placed the phone back on the desk, not watching for a reply, not expecting one immediately, because he knew that whatever response came would come on her terms, not his. And as the room settled back into silence, Ethan leaned forward slightly, his hands clasping again, his posture grounded, and for the first time since he had walked into this office, he did not feel divided between two worlds. He felt aligned within one that had simply expanded, one that now required more of him than it ever had before, and he was ready to meet that, not perfectly, not completely, but consistently, and that was enough to begin. The message did not receive an immediate reply, and Ethan did not expect one, not really, but that did not stop the quiet awareness that settled into him as the minutes passed, his phone resting on the desk within reach yet untouched, the screen dark, reflecting nothing back, and he allowed it to remain that way, resisting the instinct to check, to measure time against response. Because he understood now that this was not a space governed by his usual rules, there would be no immediate feedback, no predictable pattern, only the steady unfolding of something that required patience in a way he had never practiced before, and the rest of the day moved forward with a different rhythm. Meetings adjusted, conversations shorter, decisions made without the usual depth of analysis. Not because he was distracted, but because his focus had shifted to something that could not be solved within the walls of that office. And when the afternoon light began to fade into the cooler tones of evening, Ethan found himself standing once again by the wide window, the city stretching below in a grid of movement and light, headlights tracing slow lines. Through the streets, buildings glowing from within, each one holding its own world, its own stories, and he wondered, briefly, how many of those lives carried something just as unexpected, just as transformative, hidden beneath the surface until a single moment brought it into view. And the thought stayed with him as he finally left the office, the elevator descending in silence, the lobby quieter now, the energy of the day settling into something calmer. And when he stepped outside, the air had changed, cooler, sharper, carrying the faint hum of the evening crowd. And he did not go straight home, not immediately. Instead he walked, his pace unhurried, his direction not fixed, allowing himself to move without the structure that usually defined his time. And it felt unfamiliar at first, but not uncomfortable, just different, as if he were stepping into a version of himself that had been waiting beneath the surface, one that did not need to rush from one point to another, one that could exist within the space between. And by the time he reached his building, the sky had deepened into a soft gray, the lights inside already on, warm against the glass, and he entered without thought, the routine of it automatic. But his mind remained elsewhere, anchored in the quiet certainty of what tomorrow would bring, not in detail, not in expectation, but in presence, because he knew he would return to the park, not as a coincidence, not as chance, but as a choice, and that alone carried a weight he did not take lightly. The night passed without disruption, his sleep steady but not empty, images from the day moving through his thoughts without chaos, settling into something clear, something that did not fade when morning came. And when the first light touched the edges of the room, Ethan was already awake, standing by the window, the city below still in its early rhythm, quieter, slower, and he dressed without hesitation, his movements precise but not rushed, the same attention to detail he applied to everything. But this time the purpose behind it was different, not preparation for control, but readiness for presence. And when he stepped outside again, the air was crisp, the kind that sharpened awareness rather than dulling it. And he made his way back to the park, the path familiar now, not because he had walked it many times, but because it had already begun to matter. And as he approached the entrance, his pace slowed slightly, not out of uncertainty, but out of respect for the moment, because he understood that showing up was only the first part. How he showed up would define everything that followed. And when he stepped onto the path, the same oak trees stood tall. The same morning light filtered through the leaves. The same quiet hum of early activity moved through the space. But his focus was singular, moving ahead, scanning without urgency, until he saw them. Amara standing near the bench this time. Noah a few feet away with a small ball in his hands, bouncing it lightly against the ground. The rhythm uneven but enthusiastic, and Ethan did not approach immediately. He stopped at a distance, allowing the moment to exist without interruption, because this was not about arrival. It was about consistency, about being present without forcing interaction, and after a few seconds, Amara looked up, her gaze finding him without surprise, without hesitation, as if she had expected this, not assumed it, but accepted the possibility, and Ethan held that look, not pushing forward, not retreating, just acknowledging, and she gave a small nod, not an invitation, not a rejection, just recognition, and that was enough. He stepped closer, the distance, closing naturally this time, without tension, without the sharp edge that had defined their first meeting, and Noah noticed him almost immediately, his attention shifting from the ball to the movement, and he paused, the ball resting in his hands as he studied Ethan again, his expression thoughtful, curious, and then he smiled, not wide, not exaggerated, just a small, genuine reaction to someone he now recognized, even if he did not fully understand why, and Ethan felt that, the simplicity of it, the absence of complication, and he returned the smile, subtle, steady, meeting the moment without overstepping it. "You came back," Noah said, his voice light, and Ethan nodded, the answer clear. "I said I would," he replied, and the words carried more meaning than their surface suggested, because they were not just for the boy, they were for the pattern he was beginning to build, the consistency he had chosen, and Amara watched the exchange quietly, her expression unchanged but her presence steady, and Ethan could feel it, the evaluation still there, not in doubt, but in observation, as if each action, each moment, was being measured not for perfection but for truth, and he accepted that without resistance, because he knew that this was the only way forward, not through force, not through explanation, but through presence that did not fade. And as Noah tossed the ball lightly toward him, not with expectation but with simple curiosity, Ethan caught it without thinking, the motion natural, and he paused for a second, holding it, feeling the small weight of it in his hand before tossing it back gently. The exchange simple, almost insignificant, but it carried something more, something that did not need to be named to be understood, and as the ball moved between them again, the space that had once felt divided began to shift, not closing completely, not yet, but changing, becoming something that could hold more than silence, more than distance, and Ethan remained within it, steady, present, not trying to rush what would come next, because for the first time, he understood that time itself was not something to control, it was something to respect, and that was how this would grow, not quickly, not easily, but real. The ball moved between them in a steady rhythm now, each toss a little more certain than the last, Noah's small hands catching it with growing confidence while Ethan adjusted his throws instinctively, not too fast, not too high, matching the boy's pace without needing to think about it, and that quiet alignment settled into the space between them in a way that felt natural, unforced, the kind of connection that did not require explanation to exist, and Amara remained a few steps away, her posture relaxed but attentive, her eyes moving between them without interruption, not stepping in, not stepping away, simply observing, and Ethan could feel that presence. Even when he did not look directly at her, the awareness of it steady, grounding, as if it held the shape of everything that mattered here, and Noah laughed again when the ball bounced slightly off his hand before he caught it on the second try, the sound light, unguarded, and Ethan found himself responding without hesitation, a small smile forming, not out of habit, but out of something that came easier with each passing second, and the simplicity of that moment carried more weight than anything else could have, because it was not built on history, not shaped by expectation, it existed entirely in the present, and that was where Ethan chose to remain, not reaching ahead, not looking back, just staying within the exchange as it unfolded. "You are getting better," Ethan said, his voice even, not exaggerated, and Noah straightened slightly at the words, his shoulders lifting with quiet pride. I practice, he replied, and the certainty in his tone made Ethan pause for a fraction of a second, because it echoed something deeper, something familiar not just in sound but in meaning, and he nodded once, acknowledging it. It shows, he said, and the words were simple, but they carried recognition, something that did not go unnoticed, not by Noah, and not by Amara, who shifted her gaze briefly toward Ethan before returning it to her son. And there was something different in that glance now, not softened, not open, but less guarded than before, as if the consistency he had promised was beginning to take form, not through statements, but through actions that did not waver. And Noah tossed the ball again, this time a little farther, testing the distance, and Ethan stepped forward to catch it, closing the space between them by just enough to feel the change, not crossing into anything that had not been allowed, but no longer standing apart. And when he threw it back, his movement was slower, controlled, giving Noah the time to adjust, to meet it, and the rhythm continued, steady, unbroken, until Noah finally lowered the ball, his attention shifting again, this time not away, but upward, toward Ethan, his expression thoughtful, more focused than before. Do you live near here? Noah asked, the question simple, but carrying curiosity that reached beyond the game. And Ethan considered it for a second, not because he did not know the answer, but because he understood the weight of what was being asked, not just information, but presence, and he nodded. Not too far, he replied, keeping his tone grounded, and Noah seemed to accept that, his gaze lingering for a moment longer before he nodded once, as if placing that detail into whatever understanding he was building. And Amara stepped closer then, not abruptly, but with quiet intention, her hand resting lightly on Noah's shoulder, a small gesture that anchored him without pulling him away, and Ethan noticed it, the way she guided without interrupting, the way her presence shaped the moment without controlling it, and it reinforced something he had already begun to understand, that everything here moved with purpose, even the smallest actions, and he respected that without needing to be told. The morning continued around them, other families arriving, footsteps passing along the path, the soft hum of conversation blending into the background, but the space they occupied remained distinct, not isolated, but focused, as if time moved slightly differently within it, and Ethan became aware of that in a way that made him more careful, more deliberate, not in a calculated sense, but in a present one, choosing each action with awareness rather than instinct alone. And Noah shifted his weight again, the ball now tucked lightly under his arm. Mom, can I go to the swings again? He asked, his voice carrying that same easy tone, and Amara nodded. Stay where I can see you, she said, her words consistent, familiar, and Noah moved off without hesitation, his steps quick, confident, the ball forgotten for the moment as he climbed back onto the swing, and Ethan watched him go, his gaze following the movement until Noah settled into the seat, pushing off gently, and then he turned back to Amara, the distance between them now smaller, but the space still defined, still clear, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence not heavy, not strained, just present, holding the weight of everything that had not yet been said, and Ethan broke it carefully, not rushing, not forcing. Thank you for letting me be here, he said, his voice steady, not seeking approval, just acknowledging the truth of the moment. And Amara studied him for a second, her expression unchanged, but there was something in her eyes now that had not been there before, not acceptance, not trust, but consideration, something that moved beyond the initial barrier into a space where possibility could exist, and she nodded. Once, the movement small but deliberate. You showed up, she replied, her tone even, and the words carried more weight than a longer response could have, because they recognized action, not intention, and Ethan understood that immediately, the significance of it settling into him with quiet clarity, because this was how it would be measured, not by what he said, but by what he continued to do. And he held her gaze for a moment longer before nodding back, not in agreement, but in understanding. And as the swing creaked softly in the background, Noah's laughter rising again into the morning air, Ethan remained where he was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just present, grounded in the moment, aware that this was not a conclusion, not even close, but it was something real, something that had begun to take shape, and for the first time, he did not look at it as something to solve. He looked at it as something to build, one moment at a time, without rushing what could only grow. Through patience, through presence, through the kind of consistency that could not be faked, and that understanding stayed with him as the morning continued, steady, unshaken, guiding every step he would take from here. The swing slowed gradually as Noah dragged his sneakers against the mulch, the soft scrape grounding the motion until it came to a gentle stop, and he hopped off with the same light energy that seemed to carry him from one moment to the next without effort, his attention already shifting before his feet fully settled. But this time he did not run immediately. He paused, glancing back toward Ethan as if something had begun to form in his understanding, something not yet clear, but no longer entirely undefined, and Ethan held that look without stepping forward, without closing the space that still existed between them, because he had learned quickly that the distance mattered, not as rejection, but as structure, something that gave shape to what was happening instead of forcing it into something it was not ready to become. And Amara noticed the pause as well, her hand still resting lightly against her side, her posture steady, her presence calm but attentive, always anchored in Noah first, and she stepped slightly closer to him, not to pull him away but to remain within reach, the quiet signal of consistency that Ethan had come to recognize without needing it explained. And Noah shifted his weight again, then looked up at Ethan with a more direct focus than before. "Are you coming tomorrow too?" he asked, the question simple but carrying a different kind of meaning now, not just curiosity, but expectation, and Ethan felt that immediately, the subtle shift from coincidence to pattern, and he nodded without hesitation, his voice steady. "Yes," he said, not adding anything more, not complicating it, just confirming what had already begun, and Noah seemed satisfied with that, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he turned back toward the path, picking up his ball again and tossing it lightly in his hands as he moved, his steps unhurried, and Amara followed, her gaze lingering on Ethan for a second longer before she turned as well, not closing the moment with words, not needing to, because what had been said was enough, and Ethan remained where he was, watching them move away again. But this time the distance did not feel as wide, not as final. It felt measured, intentional, something that could be crossed over time rather than resisted in a single moment. And he stood there until they reached the edge of the park once more, until their figures blended into the morning movement. And only then did he shift, his breath steady, his posture grounded, and he turned slowly, not rushing back into anything else, not breaking the pace that had begun to shape his actions. And as he walked along the path, the sounds of the park followed him, the faint laughter, the rhythm of footsteps, the quiet hum of life continuing in small, consistent ways, and it stayed with him even as he stepped back into the city, even as the noise grew louder, sharper, more defined, because something in him had adjusted to a different frequency, one that did not disappear simply because the environment changed. And when he reached his car, the driver already waiting, the door opening as expected, Ethan paused again for just a second, his gaze lifting back toward the park one more time, not searching, just acknowledging. And then he stepped inside, the door closing softly behind him, and the car moved forward into the flow of traffic, smooth, controlled, predictable. But Ethan's thoughts did not immediately return to the structures he had always managed. They stayed with the moment that had just passed, the question Noah had asked, the way it had been asked, not with uncertainty, but with quiet expectation, and it settled into him with a weight that felt different from anything else, because it was not something he could negotiate or redefine. It was something he had to meet, consistently, honestly, and he leaned back slightly, his gaze moving to the window as the city passed by, his reflection faint against the glass, and for a moment he studied it, not critically, not analytically, just observing, as if seeing himself within this new context for the first time. And the realization was clear, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just steady, that the version of himself that had existed before would not be enough here, not fully, and that did not feel like loss. It felt like expansion, something that required more, something that demanded presence in ways he had not practiced before. And as the car turned onto a quieter street, the movement slowing slightly, Ethan reached for his phone again, not out of habit, but with intention, The contact's still there, unchanged, and he did not open a message this time. He did not type anything new. He simply looked at it for a moment, letting the simplicity of the name hold its place, and then he locked the screen, placing the phone back beside him, because he understood that what mattered now was not what he said next, but what he would continue to do, and the consistency of that would speak louder than anything he could write. And the rest of the day unfolded with that same quiet awareness. Meetings held, decisions made, but each one carried less weight than before, not because they were unimportant, but because they were no longer the only measure of his time. And as the hours passed, the thought of the next morning remained steady, not as anticipation, but as commitment, something he would return to without hesitation. And when evening came again, the city shifting into its softer light, Ethan did not linger in the office. He left at a measured pace, the routine no longer defining his end point. And when he reached home, the silence of the space felt different, not empty, but reflective, as if it held the contrast between what had been and what was beginning, and he moved through it without distraction, setting aside the usual patterns that filled his time, allowing the quiet to remain. Because it was within that quiet that his thoughts settled most clearly, and as night moved into early morning once more, the rhythm already forming, Ethan woke with the same clarity he had felt the day before, the same steady sense of direction that did not require urgency. And when he stepped outside again, the air carried that same crisp edge, the same early calm, and he made his way back toward the park without question, without delay, because this was no longer something he was testing. It was something he was building, one step at a time, one moment at a time. And as the path came into view again, the oak trees standing tall, the light filtering through in familiar patterns, Ethan did not slow this time. He walked forward with a steady pace, grounded in the understanding that presence was no longer optional. It was essential. And as he stepped onto the path once more, his gaze moved ahead, searching not with urgency, but with certainty, because he knew they would be there, not because they had promised, but because the pattern had begun, and he was no longer outside of it. The morning light settled gently across the park, softer than the day before, as if the world itself had slowed just enough to match the rhythm that was beginning to form between moments. And Ethan walked along the path with a steady pace, not scanning urgently this time, not searching with uncertainty, but with a quiet expectation that had already taken root. And it did not take long before he saw them again. Amara seated on the same bench now, a small cup of coffee resting beside her, while Noah stood a few feet away with the ball, tossing it lightly against the ground and catching it with a rhythm that had grown more controlled overnight. And Ethan slowed as he approached, not to hesitate, but to enter the moment with the same care he had begun to understand. And this time Noah saw him first, his head lifting almost immediately, recognition forming without effort. "You came back again," he said, his voice carrying a small note of certainty rather than surprise. And Ethan nodded, his expression steady. "I said I would," he replied, and the repetition of those words did not feel redundant. It felt reinforcing, like a pattern settling into place. And Noah smiled, a little wider this time, before tossing the ball toward him without hesitation, and Ethan caught it easily, the motion already familiar, already practiced, and returned it with the same measured care. And the exchange resumed as if it had never paused, as if the time between had simply been part of the same continuous rhythm. And Amara watched quietly from the bench, her gaze moving between them, and there was something different in her posture now, not relaxed completely, but less guarded, less rigid, as if the consistency Ethan had promised was beginning to register beyond a single moment. And Ethan could feel that shift without needing to name it. It existed in the space between them, subtle but real, and he did not rush to acknowledge it. He simply continued, staying within the simplicity of the moment, because he understood now that this was where everything would be built, not in declarations, not in explanations, but in repetition, in presence that did not fade when the moment passed. "Can you throw it higher?" Noah asked after a few exchanges, his tone curious, testing, and Ethan considered it briefly before nodding, adjusting his stance slightly. "I can," he said, his voice calm. And when he threw the ball this time, it arced just a little higher, just enough to challenge without overwhelming. And Noah reached up, his small hands stretching to meet it, catching it with a slight stumble before regaining balance. And he laughed, the sound bright, unfiltered, and Ethan felt something settle again, not sharp, not overwhelming, just steady, like a quiet confirmation that he was exactly where he needed to be in that moment. And Noah tossed the ball back again, more confident this time. And the rhythm continued, building slowly, naturally, without force, until Noah finally slowed, lowering the ball and stepping closer, his gaze lifting again with that same thoughtful focus that had begun to appear more often. "Do you work?" Noah asked, the question simple but direct, and Ethan paused for just a fraction of a second, not because he did not know how to answer, but because he recognized the importance of how he did, and he nodded. "Yes," he said, his tone steady. "I do." And Noah tilted his head slightly, considering that. "What do you do?" he followed, the curiosity genuine, and Ethan allowed a small breath before responding. Not with the usual explanation, not with titles or achievements, but with something simpler. Something that fit the moment. "I help people build things," he said, and Noah seemed to accept that without question, nodding once as if placing the answer into his understanding without needing more detail. And Amara's gaze shifted briefly toward Ethan at that response, something unreadable passing through her expression before it settled. Again, and Ethan caught that, not as approval, not as disapproval, but as recognition that he was choosing his words differently here, choosing to meet the moment rather than define it, and that choice mattered, even if it was not spoken aloud. Noah stepped back again, the ball returning to his hands as his attention drifted briefly toward the swings, then back again, as if he was balancing his curiosity with his routine. And Ethan remained where he was, not pushing for more conversation, not filling the space unnecessarily, because he had learned that the quiet between words carried its own weight here, and it was in that quiet that trust would begin to form, not quickly, not easily, but steadily. And after a few more moments, Amara stood, picking up her coffee and moving a step closer, her presence shifting the space slightly, grounding it again, and Ethan turned toward her, his posture still measured, his expression calm, and for a second they simply looked at each other, not in tension, not in conflict, but in acknowledgement of what was beginning to take shape. "You are consistent," she said finally, her voice even, not questioning, not praising, just stating a fact, and Ethan nodded once. "I intend to be," he replied, and there was no emphasis, no added weight, just a simple continuation of what had already been shown, and Amara studied him for a moment longer, her gaze steady. And then she nodded once as well, a small movement, but one that carried meaning beyond itself, because it marked a shift, not a full opening, not a complete change, but a step forward, and Ethan recognized it immediately, not as something to celebrate, but as something to respect, to protect, to build upon without rushing. And Noah moved again, this time toward the swings, his steps light, his energy returning to its natural flow, and Amara watched him go before turning back slightly, her voice lower now, meant only for Ethan. "This is not easy," she said, not as a warning, but as a truth, and Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. "I know," he replied, and he did, not fully, not completely, but enough to understand that what stood in front of him would require more than presence. It would require patience, accountability, and time, and Amara held that look for a second longer before nodding again, her expression steady, and then she turned back toward Noah, her attention returning to him without delay, without division, and Ethan remained where he was, not stepping closer, not stepping away, just present, grounded in the understanding that this was how it would continue, not in leaps, not in sudden change, but in small, deliberate steps that built something real, something lasting. And as the morning light shifted slightly, the sun climbing higher, casting clearer shadows across the ground, Ethan felt that same quiet certainty settle within him again, not as a conclusion, but as direction, and he stayed within it, steady, unshaken, knowing that this was only the beginning, but it was a beginning he would not walk away from. The sound of the swing chains carried a steady rhythm now, each forward motion followed by a soft creak that seemed to settle into the air like a quiet heartbeat, and Ethan stood just off to the side, not too close, not distant either, his posture relaxed but attentive, watching as Noah pushed himself higher with small bursts of effort, his legs stretching forward, his laughter breaking through the calm of the morning with a clarity that felt untouched by everything else surrounding it. And Amara remained nearby, her presence constant, her gaze moving between them without urgency, without interruption, as if she had learned how to hold space without needing to control it. And Ethan noticed that more clearly now than before, the way she allowed moments to unfold while still anchoring them, the way her silence carried intention rather than distance, and it shifted something in him again, something quieter than the first shock, but deeper, more rooted, because he was beginning to understand not just what had been lost, but what had been built in his absence, and the weight of that did not push him back, it pulled him forward in a different way, not through force, but through awareness. And Noah slowed the swing again, his sneakers brushing the ground until the motion softened, and he hopped down with a small bounce, turning toward Ethan with a look that held more certainty than it had even minutes before. "Do you know how to climb that?" he asked, pointing toward the taller structure at the edge of the playground. And Ethan followed his gaze, the metal bars rising higher than the rest, designed for older children, more challenging, and he nodded slightly. "I do," he said, his tone even. And Noah's eyes lit up just enough to show interest without turning it into excitement. "Can you show me?" he asked, and there was something different in that request, something that carried trust, not complete, not unquestioned, but forming, and Ethan did not respond immediately, his gaze shifting briefly to Amara, not asking permission, but acknowledging her presence in the moment, and she met his look without hesitation, her expression steady, her posture unchanged, and after a second, she gave a small nod, not opening the space fully, but allowing it to move forward, and that was enough. Ethan stepped toward the structure, his movements measured, not exaggerated, and he reached for the bars, his hands gripping them with familiarity, not showing off, not pushing beyond what was needed, just demonstrating the motion, the placement, the balance. And Noah watched closely, his attention focused in a way that showed he was not just observing, he was learning. And when Ethan stepped back after a few movements, Noah moved forward, placing his hands where he had seen, testing the grip, adjusting his footing. And Ethan remained close enough to guide if needed, but not so close that he took over, his voice low, steady. "Take your time," he said, and Noah nodded, his jaw tightening slightly in concentration, his small frame pulling upward with effort. And for a second, he hesitated, his foot slipping slightly before finding the bar again. And Ethan felt the instinct to step in, to correct, to stabilize, but he held back, just enough, because he had seen how Amara guided, how she allowed space for effort, and he mirrored that now, his presence steady without interfering, and Noah pushed again, this time more certain, his movement finding rhythm, and when he reached the next level, he paused, looking down briefly before lifting his gaze again. And there was something in that moment, something quiet but clear, a shift from uncertainty to confidence that did not come from being told, but from doing, and Ethan felt it as much as he saw it. The connection forming not through words, but through shared space, through patience, through presence that did not disappear when things became uncertain. And Noah climbed a little higher before stopping, his breath quick but controlled, and he looked down. Again, this time not with hesitation, but with awareness. "I did it," he said, his voice carrying a small note of pride, and Ethan nodded once, his expression steady. "You did," he replied, and the simplicity of that acknowledgement held more weight than praise ever could, because it recognized effort, not just outcome. And Noah smiled, not wide, not exaggerated, but real, and he climbed down carefully, retracing his steps with the same focus, and when his feet touched the ground again, he looked up at Ethan, the connection clearer now, not defined, but present, and Amara stepped closer then, her hand resting briefly on Noah's shoulder, her gaze moving from him to Ethan, and there was something in that look that had shifted again, not softened fully, but less guarded, less distant, as if the consistency she had been measuring was beginning to take form in a way she could not ignore. "You did not rush him," she said quietly, her voice even, and Ethan met her gaze, understanding the meaning behind the words. "He did not need me to," he replied, and Amara held that for a second, her expression steady, and then she nodded once, the movement small but deliberate, and it carried more weight than agreement. It carried recognition, and Ethan felt that settle into him with a quiet certainty. Because this was not about proving something in a single moment. It was about showing something over time, something that could not be forced, and Noah stepped forward again, picking up his ball, his energy returning to its natural rhythm. But his movements were different now, slightly more aware, slightly more connected, as if something had shifted within him as well, and Ethan remained where he was, not stepping closer, not stepping back, just present, grounded in the understanding that this was how it would continue, not through sudden change, but through steady, consistent presence that did not waver. And as the morning light grew stronger, casting clearer lines across the playground, the space between them no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like something that could be crossed, not all at once, but gradually, with each moment that held true, and Ethan stayed within that space, not trying to define it, not trying to claim it, just building it, one step at a time, knowing that what mattered now was not what had been lost, but what could still be created. And for the first time, that possibility did not feel distant, it felt real. The morning had shifted again, not in light or sound, but in something less visible, something that settled quietly between moments and made them feel fuller, more deliberate, as if each second now carried weight that had not been there before. And Ethan stood near the edge of the play structure, his posture relaxed but grounded, watching as Noah adjusted his grip on the bars again, repeating the motion he had learned just minutes earlier. Not perfectly, not smoothly, but with intention, and that intention mattered more than precision, more than speed, because it showed effort, it showed growth, and Ethan recognized that without needing to name it. His gaze steady, his presence consistent, not stepping in, not correcting, just there, exactly where he had been each time the boy looked up, and Noah did look up again, briefly, checking, confirming, and Ethan met that glance without hesitation, without overreaction, simply holding it for a second before giving a small nod, and that was enough. Noah continued, his movements finding a rhythm that belonged to him now, not borrowed, not copied, but built through repetition, and Amara stood a few steps behind, her arms loosely folded, her posture calm, but there was something in her stillness that had changed, something less guarded, less rigid, as if the tension she had carried at the beginning had begun to loosen, not because it had disappeared, but because it was no longer the only thing shaping the moment. And Ethan noticed that too, not directly, not by staring, but by sensing the shift in the space around them, the way it no longer felt divided, but layered, holding more than one truth at the same time. And that awareness settled into him with a quiet certainty, because it meant that what he was doing was being seen, not just observed, but understood in its consistency. And Noah climbed down again, his feet landing with a soft thud, his breath steadying as he straightened. And he looked at Ethan with a different kind of focus now, not just curiosity, not just recognition, but something closer to trust, still forming, still fragile, but real. Will you come again tomorrow? Noah asked, his voice carrying that same simple tone, but the question itself had changed. It was no longer about today or yesterday. It was about what would continue, and Ethan did not hesitate, his answer immediate, grounded. Yes, he said, and Noah nodded, accepting it without doubt, without needing further reassurance, because the pattern had already begun to prove itself, and that was what mattered. And Amara stepped closer then, her gaze moving between them before settling on Ethan, and there was a pause, not long, not heavy, just enough to hold something that had not yet been said. And when she spoke, her voice was quieter than before, more measured. He notices everything, she said, not as a warning, not as a critique, but as a truth. And Ethan met her gaze, understanding the weight behind it. So do you, he replied, and there was no edge to it, no challenge, just recognition. And Amara held that for a second, her expression unreadable but steady, and then she gave a small nod, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just acknowledging, and the moment settled again into something calm, something balanced, and Noah shifted his attention back to the ball, tossing it lightly once more before stopping, his gaze lifting again as if another thought had formed. Do you have a house? He asked, the question simple but direct, and Ethan allowed a brief breath before answering, not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood that each answer shaped Something larger now. Yes, he said, his tone steady. I do. And Noah nodded, considering that. Is it big? He followed, and Ethan's expression softened slightly, not into amusement, but into something lighter. It is bigger than it needs to be, he said, and Noah seemed to think about that for a second before nodding again, as if placing the idea somewhere he could understand later. And Amara watched the exchange quietly, her gaze steady, and there was something in her expression now that had shifted again, not fully open, but no longer closed, as if she was allowing the possibility of something she had kept firmly contained before, and Ethan did not move to fill that space. He did not push it further. He simply remained where he was, letting the moment exist without forcing it into something more, because he understood now that what mattered was not how quickly things changed, but how consistently they held. And Noah stepped back again, his energy settling into a calmer rhythm, his movements less scattered, more aware, as if the presence around him had begun to anchor him in a different way, and Ethan noticed that too, not as a cause, not as a result, but as something that was happening within the space they shared, and it reinforced what he had already begun to understand. That presence alone could shape more than words ever could, and Amara glanced at the time briefly, the movement small but purposeful, and then she looked back at Noah. We have to go, she said, gently, and Noah nodded, not resisting, not arguing, simply accepting, and he walked over, taking her hand without hesitation, the same familiar gesture that had defined their rhythm from the beginning, and Ethan watched it, not with distance, not with exclusion, but with understanding, because he knew that this was not something he could step into immediately. It was something he would have to earn, over time, through consistency, through presence that did not fade. And as they turned to leave, Noah looked back once more, his expression open, unguarded. See you tomorrow, he said, and Ethan nodded, his voice steady. See you tomorrow, he replied, and the words carried weight now, not as a promise, but as a continuation. And Amara held Ethan's gaze for a second longer before turning fully, her posture steady, her steps unhurried, and as they walked away, the distance forming again, it did not feel like separation, it felt like space, something that would be crossed again, not all at once, but gradually, with each moment that held true, and Ethan remained where he was for a few seconds longer, watching them until they disappeared from view, and then he exhaled slowly, his breath steady, his posture grounded, because he understood now, more clearly than before, that what he was building was not something that could be rushed. It was something that required time, patience, and a consistency that did not break. And for the first time, that did not feel like a burden, it felt like purpose. The path felt familiar now in a way that had nothing to do with repetition alone, as if each step Ethan took toward the park carried not just memory, but intention, something steady and deliberate that had begun to shape his mornings without resistance. And the air was cooler this time, the kind that settled into the lungs and sharpened awareness. And when he stepped beneath the oak trees, the light filtering through in soft layers, he did not slow, he did not scan, he simply walked forward with the quiet certainty that had grown stronger with each day, and they were there, just as they had been, not in the exact same position, not in the same posture, but present within the same rhythm that now felt shared rather than separate. And Noah was already moving, his small frame crossing the open space between the bench and the play structure, the ball tucked under his arm, his steps quick but grounded. And when he saw Ethan, there was no pause this time, no hesitation, just recognition that turned into action. You are here, Noah said, his voice carrying that simple certainty that had become more defined with each meeting. And Ethan nodded, his response just as steady. I am, he replied, and the exchange did not need more, because the pattern had already spoken for itself, and Noah moved closer, not stopping at the edge of the space but stepping fully into it, holding the ball out without thinking, and Ethan took it, the motion smooth, natural, and tossed it back with the same measured ease, and the rhythm began again. But this time it felt different, not just consistent, but connected, as if the space between them had shifted from distance into something that could hold both of them without resistance. And Amara stood nearby, her gaze resting on them not with the same guarded stillness as before, but with something quieter, something that had begun to allow Not fully, not without awareness, but without the immediate tension that had defined the first moment, and Ethan felt that difference without needing to look directly at her. It existed in the way the space held itself, in the way nothing felt divided anymore. And Noah laughed again when the ball bounced off his shoulder before he caught it. His reaction immediate, unfiltered, and Ethan smiled, not out of politeness, not out of habit, but because the moment itself carried something genuine, something that did not need to be constructed. And after a few more exchanges, Noah slowed, stepping closer again, his gaze lifting with a clarity that had not been there before. "Can you come with us?" he asked, and the question settled into the air with a different kind of weight. Not curiosity, not testing, but invitation, simple, direct, and Ethan paused for just a second, not because he did not want to answer, but because he understood the shift it represented, and his eyes moved briefly. To Amara, not seeking permission, but acknowledging that the moment did not exist in isolation, and she met his gaze, her expression steady, her posture calm, and there was a silence that held something unspoken, something that had been building over each day, each consistent return, and after a moment, she gave a small nod, not expansive, not dramatic, just enough, and Ethan felt that settle into him with a quiet certainty. Because it was not given lightly, it was allowed, and that made all the difference. And he looked back at Noah, his voice steady. "Where are you going?" he asked, and Noah's expression brightened slightly. "We get breakfast," he said, and Ethan nodded once, the answer simple. "Then I can walk with you," he replied, and Noah smiled. Not wide, not exaggerated, but real, and he turned immediately, taking a few steps toward the path before stopping to look back, making sure Ethan was coming, and Ethan followed, his pace measured, not overtaking, not falling behind, simply moving within the same rhythm, and Amara walked beside Noah, her hand lightly resting on his shoulder, her presence still steady, still grounded, but there was something else now, something that had begun to open in small, careful ways. And as they moved through the park, the sounds of the morning surrounding them, footsteps, distant voices, the soft rustle of leaves overhead, Ethan felt the shift more clearly than ever, not as a sudden change, but as something that had been built piece by piece, moment by moment, until it became something real, something that could hold more than silence, more than distance. And Noah talked as they walked, his words simple, moving from one thought to the next without pause, pointing out things that mattered to him, a dog passing by, a bench he liked, a path he had run on before, and Ethan listened, not with the distant attention he had once given to conversations, but with focus, with presence, because he understood now that listening was part of showing up. And Amara walked quietly beside them, her gaze forward, but there was no tension in her silence, no resistance, just awareness. And when they reached the small cafe at the edge of the park, Noah stopped, looking up at both of them as if the moment had reached a point where something needed to be acknowledged, and he stepped closer to Amara, his voice softer now. "Can he come in?" he asked, and the question was simple, but it carried everything that had been building, and Amara looked down at him first, her expression calm, her hand resting briefly against his shoulder, and then she lifted her gaze to Ethan, holding it for a second longer than before, and in that look there was no longer just evaluation, there was consideration, and finally, something that had not been there at the beginning, trust, not complete, not without boundaries, but present, and she nodded once. "He can come," she said, her voice steady, and Noah smiled, turning immediately toward the door, pushing it open with both hands, and Ethan followed, stepping inside with the same measured calm he had carried from the beginning. But something inside him had shifted completely, because this was no longer about proving something, it was about being part of something. And as they moved toward the counter, the quiet hum of the cafe surrounding them, the scent of coffee and warm bread filling the air, Ethan realized that the distance he had once felt was no longer the defining space between them. It had become something else, something that could be crossed, something that had already begun to change, and for the first time, he did not see it as something he had to reach. He saw it as something he was already walking within, one step at a time, steady, present, and real.